What's happened to number 3?
Sometimes the short-time survival is important than, long-term well-being, maybe. That's why, what they are doing, monetary policy, thinking one day there will be a smooth landing, but nobody knows. But at the same time, you see a country like Singapore, they made the system everybody come and dump the money there.
All right, well, look, can I try and capture some of the ideas that are going around in plenary, even if I'm stopping the conversations? Does anyone want to actually contribute with a voice to the kind of elements that you've identified on your table, whether you're a table leader or someone else, but something you're passionate about or feel is not being considered in this mix currently of risks? Anyone at all? Because otherwise I'm going to go to Rajiv Dimri. Rajiv, where are you? I'm going to keep turning here. Rajiv Dimri, he's registered. Rajiv, are you in the room? Ah, Rajiv, yes, forgive me. Because you talk about lack of enforcement of good building codes, increasing losses in cases of natural disasters. Now, obviously after what happened in Bangladesh, that's brought, and it's happened in Cambodia. But what's on your mind there?
A couple of things. I look around India and, even small sort of natural excessive rain or small earthquakes lead to disproportionate losses of buildings coming down, loss of human life. And invariably it comes out that there was lack of building code following because of somebody overlooked it or other lack of sort of discipline by the government in enforcing those laws. So laws exist. I also came across a World Bank study which said that the natural disasters are actually man-made because of these, lack of building codes that are enforced, and that leads to a more loss than usual. And that's a risk because this being a region, as you mentioned, cyclones and earthquake-prone, and therefore enforcement of correct building codes would be one step in mitigating those risks.
Because let me promote this thought or provoke it, which is that what happened in Dhaka or in the suburb of Dhaka, any of you here, has really highlighted what must be a much wider risk because of the kind of abuse of these regulations. I think there were 4 generators on an extended floor at the top. I don't know if it was insured, but that is a blatant risk which is being taken.
Correct. Yes. I mean, there are cases like that in India where hospitals catch fire because of the wrong...
Can you all hear, by the way? Can we turn up the microphone a little bit? Okay.
And so those things get reported in India as well, and it invariably comes up where building codes, fire codes are not followed because somebody overlooks them. And that's, what came in Dhaka was what picked up by the global press, but it happens in India every once in a while.
Does anyone want to add to this about the obligations now on governments? Because it builds on what I think, Richard, you've talked about in your message, which is about good government reduces risks. Now, you're going to talk in a moment anyway, but do you want to add to that about what you see? Good government, how do you define that? Because what we're talking about is, in a place like Bangladesh, and that's obviously the most recent example, is a kind of negligent, indifferent, blind eye-turning government.
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit at our table, and a lot of different things came up. Fairness, predictability, efficiency of government, you know, the willingness to deal with problems up front and not wait until they festered or wait until your successor has to deal with them. So there are a lot of factors that go into it, but if you look around, a lot of what we're talking about, the response to hurricanes, the flooding from, you know, runoffs after illegal logging, the way the factories are run, a lot of this is governance, and not just government governance, but corporate governance as well.
What obligations do you think that now is creating in a very transparent environment where people can report this kind of stuff? The fact that governments are simply either too pressed or indifferent or actually actively ignoring?
Well, I think one thing is the people who insure risks and deal with risks have to do a better job of sort of predicting the quality of the response based on the quality of governance, and that's an intriguing prospect for all of us who are in the measurement business. But then the other thing is that, you know, citizens themselves have to look at these things and not accept it as inevitable and push for a better quality of governance in order to protect themselves.
For those of you in the insurance business, and Martin, I know obviously I can come back to you, but what about the whistleblowing, the importance of whistleblowing in all of this? In other words, people who must realize that things are not as good as they should be, of course concerned about their jobs, but also concerned about what happens to them.
Yeah, I think it's comes in with the enforcement aspects, really. I think the systems don't necessarily encourage the transparency in the enforcement, and the whistleblowing certainly isn't something that we hear of I'm not so deeply experienced, but we don't hear about it very often. Clearly corporations are doing this, they're providing hotlines for their teams or their staff to report things in. It's a question of governance, but it doesn't necessarily permeate some of the risks that we're talking about.
But are you faced, look, I'm not in the insurance business or the risk business as such, but are you faced with the reality that there can be regulations on the statute book, which in theory mean things are going to be okay, but actually the oversight is so woeful that it's almost meaningless?
Yeah, it has to be a risk, and the recent building collapses would exacerbate that. I don't know of any insurance on those properties that we've discussed. But yes, I think there's not a naivety in the insurance industry that a regulation equals a practice, but it's events like this make us wonder how much is out there which is not as well constructed as it should have been, that we are on risk for.
All right, does anyone want to come in again on governance? I'm trying to push things very quickly on a number of issues here, but particularly how governments can be seized and sensitized much more openly to this issue, whether it be on this or flood and disaster prevention. Anyone want to come in, please? Yes. Microphone, I think, should be here. Just introduce yourself as well.
Okay. Alyssa Goldberg, I'm the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations, but spent most of my career, in fact, responding to natural disasters abroad. Two things that I would say in terms of roles for government: obviously risk reduction and disaster response laws. I mean, we've been talking about this now for about a decade. Governments are only now starting to implement it. But the flip side to that is also the role and responsibility of the private sector. There was a new report that came out about 3 weeks ago, the Global Assessment Report, which talked about the impact increasingly in urban areas. We know it's going to cost about $100 billion a year because disasters are increasingly having this concentrated impact on urban areas where the private sector is making significant investments, whether it's IT, infrastructure, et cetera. So yeah, it's about governments setting out the regulatory framework, but it's also working in partnership with the private sector.
What is mobilizing governments? Are they doing it off their own back, or are outside forces forcing them down this track now?
I would say it's a combination of both. When you've been through a major catastrophic event, you certainly see the impact that it has. When governments themselves go through the catastrophic event, they know what they have to face the next time, and others are watching to see how they're responding. Japan was a major eye-opener for a number of countries, in particular within the OECD. Japan's the best country capable of managing a disaster, and it had major difficulties in responding to the Fukushima disaster.
Okay. Christopher Fossek, where are you? Over here. From Jones Lang LaSalle, particularly on infrastructure and the broader issues about what is being built and how good it is.
Yeah, I think I would say regulation is obviously very important, but the implementation around that regulation is even more important. I think the risks, and I put down three, Nick. One is country risk and market risk. The second one is excessive liquidity, and the next one is the environmental impact risk. On the country and market risk, Jones Lang LaSalle, the company I work for, we do an annual transparency index, which covers the entire sort of globe. And we try to evaluate the level of risk in the market within that country and that country itself. And we've got various different sort of sub-indices that we use, but we look at performance measures such as indices and valuations. We look at market fundamentals such as data in that market. We look at governance and listed vehicles, corporate governance, as well as financial disclosure, regulation and legal, regulation of land and property registration, debt regulation in the market, which is a big part of real estate, property transfer and ownership, and then transaction process. We look at the sort of sales and the leasing processes. That helps our clients to at least evaluate the risk from a country and market risk when they're making real estate investments or occupying it. The environmental impact, I think we've touched on some of those. The regulation around building codes, we touched on that a moment ago, is very important. The urbanization that's going on in the developing of the world at the moment is huge. We've got buildings going up every minute of the day. We've got millions of people moving into cities, and buildings are being